Hello, hello. Welcome to the My Sugar-Free Journey podcast. Again, here with, my name is Aaron Farmer. I'm here with Dr. Nadia Pateguana. And Dr. Pateguana, I love that. I love that name. It's I don't think I've ever seen it anywhere else. I don't think I've ever seen anyone have it. Pateguana.
It's not mine. Thank you. It's my
It's not
husband's.
yours. Okay.
It
Fantastic.
used to be really simple. Brito. Super simple.
Brito. Oh,
Uh,
that's why your email is Brito. Okay.
that's right. Well, it's
Okay.
Brito Pataguana, so just to
Okay.
make it hard. But anyway, it's an African name. So it's a like actual African name. And so maybe that's why. And I think to a specific region of Africa. And there's a lot of sort of names like Pateguan instead of Pateguana or similar to it. So anyway, there you go. Now you
Thanks.
know.
Yeah, it was good. I love interesting names because I have a name that's very difficult for people to pronounce sometimes, and because it's missing a letter,
That's
like
like
it just
me. Yes, I
yeah.
understand. Like Aaron.
Yeah, it's just pronounced like Aaron, like every other Aaron that you've ever seen. But for some reason that it's not
As I
there, and
thought it
people.
was, because I think I referred to you as Aaron, and I think
Yeah.
I write to you as Aaron, and then I saw it right in front of me, and I was like, "Oh no, I've been saying his name wrong this whole
No, no,
time."
it's Aaron. It's Aaron. That's right. That's perfect.
All right.
But I get Aaron, and I get Aaron, and I get a lot of weird.
All
It's
right.
just Aaron.
Well, there you go.
But anyway, thanks for coming back on the show. So Dr. Pateguana, Nadia, is here for the second time. So she was way back in episode 30, and this is like episode 160 something or another. And so it's been a while. Last time she was here, we had a long talk about fasting, and today we're talking about her new book, The PCOS Plan. Right, PCOS plan, right?
That's right.
And talking about PCOS and what is going on with that. And so I got a copy of the book. It's fascinating, and probably the one thing I like about it most is that as I've read a lot of books, I've been doing this for a long time. I've read a lot of books. PCOS usually gets a chapter in a book about the larger subject of insulin resistance. This is the first time I've ever seen a book with a full length book just dealing with PCOS, just breaking down what's going on with that. And I learned a lot. In fact, I was just telling my wife last night, and this might be a little embarrassing, but I was telling my wife last night, I had no idea that you could have menstruation without ovulation. I thought those two things were connected. They were the same
I didn't
thing,
know that
basically.
either. When I even after having a naturopathic medical degree, and I know um, that might sound crazy, right? Especially because we go into a lot of things in detail, but
Mm-hmm.
a lot of these things get swept over, you know?
Yeah. Like I had no idea. I thought those were the exact same thing, and they were just two words for the same process. Just kind of fine tuning it. I had no
And
idea that
that's
you
why
could do that.
actually the diagnostic criteria for PCOS says either anovulation or
Mm-hmm.
irregular menstruation, because they're two different things.
Well, see, and that's the kind of information that's in this book, where you're really getting a breakdown into what is going on in the body. But before we get into all of the science and everything, you tell a very interesting story at the very beginning of the book about your personal struggle with PCOS and your struggle to get pregnant at the beginning. Can you kind of go over that with us so we have a little bit of background?
Absolutely. So I think in a little bit we'll probably get into, as you said, more of the science. And to be fair, I do want to say, Aaron, that there are lots of books on PCOS out there. The problem is they're very conflicting and contradictory to what we're saying.
Okay.
So there are books on PCOS, but women are very confused. And so just yesterday, I got this question from a lady who ordered our book and hasn't gotten it yet. But she says, I've read so many books on PCOS, or so many things about PCOS and about so many different diets. How do I know this is the one, right? And hopefully we'll get into that a little bit when we talk
Yeah.
about insulin. So just to be fair, there are lots of books on PCOS out there. Maybe not a ton, but there are some. The problem is they're not saying, I think, what we're saying. And this is the reason why we wrote this book, okay? Because as you said, when we talk about insulin resistance, PCOS gets maybe a chapter. Dr. Fung has mentioned when you go to insulin resistant or low carb or certain conferences, PCOS gets a mention. It's always mentioned, but you never go into it, right? It's not given the importance that it truly deserves, because it is the most common endocrine condition in women. And it affects anywhere from possibly 10 to 30% of all women. And as Dr. Fung says in our book, and as we often mention when we talk about PCOS, if it was just about a little bit of acne or maybe a few missed periods, then maybe it wouldn't be such a big deal. But it's a huge deal, as women with PCOS know. It is common, it's serious, and it's debilitating because it's associated with so many other serious concerns, including infertility, of course, and diabetes and obesity and heart disease and cancer and so many things. So I just wanted to I know we're going to get into that. So this is why this book, I think, to us was so important, right? It's not just this thing, as you said, that should only be mentioned in a paragraph. It
Right.
really does deserve its own forum. So this is why we wrote the book. So thank you for that mention.
Mm-hmm.
So my story it's my story. So of course, to me, and I've told it so many times, it's an interesting story because I wasn't supposed to be a woman with PCOS, right? I didn't look like a woman with PCOS or whatever that means. Now we know.
You've always been pretty thin, pretty healthy looking.
Healthy looking, exactly. Yeah. So my story begins, I think, as a child, okay? I found out later on that because my mother couldn't breastfeed, and I was born in Mozambique. I was born in an African country in the midst of war, okay? Very few resources. My mother she married at 16, had me at 18, and she was alone. My father, unfortunately, was in the war. My grandparents were gone. So I found out, I didn't know this, that my mother, for whatever reason, couldn't breastfeed. And so I was given milk with honey as my, so this is how my life started, nutrition-wise. As a child, I was a terrible and picky eater, very, very thin. But I basically didn't eat any real food until I was into my late 20s, early 30s. And by this, I mean I never ate meat and vegetables. I hated it. So what did I eat instead? Anything I could get my hands on that were carb-laden. That's the only thing I had palate for. And I didn't eat tons of it, so probably why I didn't gain a lot of weight. But I ate all the time, constantly. And I had what's now known as rebound hypoglycemia. Yeah. So I had this constant sort of lower blood sugar, shaky, fainting. I was a girl that fainted all the time, all of these things. Yeah. But why? Because I was constantly eating sugar on its own, carbs on its own, and then I would have a high insulin spike and a drop. That's called rebound hypoglycemia. But when you look at a very thin, frail girl that has the shakes and faints all the time, you think, well, poor thing, she needs more sugar, right? And I think that's the message that a lot of women with PCOS are getting. Oh no, I don't have diabetes. I don't have high blood sugars. I have low blood sugars, so I need more carbs. These low blood sugars are in fact rebound hypoglycemia. So when I work with women like that, I know right away. And I don't want them to get fooled into the thought that if I have rebound hypoglycemia, it means I need more sugar. No, it doesn't. It means you need more stable blood sugars. You either need to avoid the carbs totally, or you have to have very rich, satiating meals. This is what I did not have. I didn't have protein. I didn't have enough fat. I only had sugar, all kinds of sugar, fruit, bread, latte. These were and lots and lots of candy and Coca-Cola. These were my quote unquote foods of choice. And that's, to be honest with you, all I ate my entire life. Fast forward 20 something years, almost 30 years. And then I discovered that I have PCOS. And it actually was a journey to actually get my doctor to test me. And it was because I knew a little bit that I was able to press for it and ask for specifically what I wanted, the test that I wanted, because he didn't want to test me otherwise because I was so thin. I didn't appear to have PCOS. And of course, as you know from reading the book and my story, I wanted to know why I wasn't getting pregnant. And I had a lot of other symptoms that let me know that I most likely did have PCOS, even though I didn't fit that ideal PCOS overweight. And now we know that overweight women don't necessarily have PCOS, and PCOS women are not necessarily overweight, but they are related. They're cousins, okay? And they're related by insulin. And so we get into that in the book. But my story really was that's my personal journey. My professional journey was that I was raised in Canada, and when I finished, I did a biology degree in Canada, and then I went on to studying naturopathic medicine. I decided to do naturopathic medicine instead of conventional medicine because I was frustrated. I was frustrated with the way certain health concerns that I had were being handled. I had IBS, irritable bowel syndrome, and a couple of other things like rebound hypoglycemia. And I wasn't satisfied with the way my doctor was handling it. So I thought, I'm not going to go into this profession. I'm going to go into naturopathic medicine because I thought it was more holistic and would look at the root cause of things a little deeper. So I think that that's how, at least my perspective into my interest into wanting to look at the root cause of things started, not just symptomatic treatment of conditions. So that was my career choice. But when I graduated from the naturopathic college, I was 25 years old in Canada, and I decided that I wanted to go back to my home country. So where I was originally from, Mozambique. And I did. I moved to Mozambique at 25. I had family there still. And I thought I was going to work in the impoverished communities. I really wanted to work with mothers and children, and in the nutrition field, yes, but I thought that was going to be the community I was going to work with. That unfortunately was not available to me because of politics. I just didn't have the opportunity to work for the ministry. I wanted to, but it wasn't available. The only thing that was available to me was opening up a private clinic in the city. That's what the Minister of Health told me I could do. And that's what I ended up doing. So that's what I did. And then my shocker, and you know this from the story, Aaron, was that the people looking for my help were overweight, diabetic, metabolically unhealthy individuals in the city. And that's not what I was expecting. And to be honest, I wasn't prepared for it. I wasn't prepared for it. I didn't really learn weight loss diets like any other, conventional doctors or naturopathic doctors were not really taught about this. So I had to learn. And I was young and eager, and I had a full house. And people were very forgiving, as I often say, and willing to learn with me. And so in the first few years, I learned that in order to help people with metabolic syndrome, the move more, eat less, calorie in, calorie out theory was not happening. So early on, I learned that it was what you ate and how you ate that had a bigger impact. So I did start with lower carb diets, real food diets. And along the way, I developed this condition. I made one connection early on in my career when I was young and not trying to start a family yet. I learned that for whatever reason, when women followed this low carb diet that I was recommending, they were reporting higher fertility. So there was a lot of women with metabolic syndrome struggling with fertility, pregnancy, in their 30s and late 20s, 30s, and even early 40s. And I was getting a lot of, because I was the only person in my city and really in the whole country doing this weight loss and metabolic sort of clinic, I had a lot of clients. I had people coming from all over the country, and I was getting a lot of reports about, why did I get pregnant? I mentioned a few cases of, one couple that had been married for 13 years, had done tons of IVF, adopted a child when she was a baby, and she was now 6 or 7 years old, and the wife got pregnant, and the husband wanted to know why. Like, what did I do? Like, what was this diet that I was, and I had no idea. Right. So I would say, well, it's the detox. It's the detox. That's what we used to say back then. So it's a very interesting journey. So then when I developed PCOS and I had my fertility struggles, I started to look back and think, I have to make the connection here. What's the connection? And so I decided to go and follow this strict low carb diet. Because remember, I had never done anything close to it. Right. Because I was thin, I just continued to eat my carbs all the time. And not just that, I was highly addicted to carbs. I didn't want to eat anything else. If you had told me then, fast instead, I would have. If I had known, I would have rather fasted than eat real food. I would, it was that bad. And I find that a lot of women I work with now, I sort of work with both, sort of trying to help them with low carb and fasting, because there's no one size fits all. So that's how my story began. It was my own personal story. I learned a lot from other women. And then over those 2 or 3 years, my fertility years that I was trying to have babies, and I did successfully have 2 babies, I learned a lot. And so after that, I didn't want to do anything else. This is all I wanted to focus on.
Yeah, when you find something that works, I know you kind of want to stick with that. You mentioned that your parents grew up in a very torn, time in your early formative years or like that. I've seen some science that says that babies that grow up in that area, because they their mothers have high cortisol levels during that time, and the babies have higher cortisol levels, that tends to affect their metabolic health later on in life. Have you seen any connection between, let's say, high levels of cortisol in vitro or in utero and PCOS?
I think that's super amazing that you're saying that. When I work with women and men, I work with a lot of men. Luckily for me, men, my passion is PCOS, but the reason why I work with a lot of men is because my primary focus is metabolic syndrome. So I work with a lot of men on diabetes, especially, and also obesity. But when I speak with my clients, I always start by mentioning my 5 pillars, which are how often you eat, what time you eat, what you eat, so diet, and then stress and sleep because of cortisol.
Mm-hmm.
And it's so interesting to me that you're mentioning that. I don't know that I've ever made that connection. So thank you, because now I'm curious. But I know that cortisol has a direct impact on your insulin production. So yes, I believe that I was exposed to high insulin, likely because my mother, and not because my mother ate any sort of way. My mother's was very thin, and is still very thin today. But again, so was I. So that means 0, right? The fact that she's thin. But I don't think she was a carb addict. I don't think that to this day that she eats a lot of carbs, and she's not pre-diabetic or diabetic or hypertensive like I eventually became. Never, thank goodness, never had cancer like I did or anything else related. Okay. But the one thing that I know for sure my mother was highly exposed to was cortisol and stress from the age of about 16 to probably much later. But I know that in the course of my pregnancy, so when she was pregnant with me, I know she went through a lot of stress. So that is so amazing that you brought that up.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah, it's the cortisol issue is something that I've kind of been curious about, because I don't think it's something that we, pardon me, should have turned that off. I don't think it's something that we've looked at so much. And, to your other point, it's worth repeating that when you're looking at, say, metabolic syndrome, you've got 5 things that 5 symptoms of metabolic syndrome. If you have 3 of them, you have metabolic syndrome. If you have one of those 5 things that you can have is obesity. So you cannot be obese and still have metabolic syndrome,
100%.
because there's certain people, I don't know what the numbers are, maybe 20% of the people that they just don't put on weight. They can eat whatever they want. They don't put on weight, and they can still have metabolic syndrome. They can still have the symptoms of hyperinsulinemia. They just don't put on the weight.
I actually don't know what the percentage is, but it's at least that, because I always say this, right? We have 2 extremes and we have the hybrids, the in-betweens. I've got the very thin but highly diabetic, and like me, like I was someone who was very thin, but the problem with it, and it's exactly that, it's genetic.
Mm-hmm.
Genetically, I don't put on subcutaneous fat, or at least not until I'm way down the spectrum, because I did start to gain weight. But the majority of that weight goes straight into my organs, so visceral fat, and I start to get sick right away. So I did develop diabetes, hypertension, cancer, as I said, and there's many cancers that are related to metabolic syndrome, and some mood disorders and things that are probably related. So right away, even though I was thin, and I work with a lot of these people, I work with very thin, highly diabetic individuals because they don't genetically put on weight. Then I work with morbidly obese individuals or obese. Maybe morbid obesity is when they already have certain symptoms. But just before they become morbidly obese, they don't have hypertension, they don't have diabetes, but they're extremely overweight. And that's a protective mechanism, I think. It's genetic. Their insulin and their fat, sort of that organ, is driving all of their fat into their subcutaneous fat. It's protecting their organs, at least at first, right? Mm-hmm. Eventually, as I say, the dam breaks. And once the dam breaks for the thin or for the obese individuals, you kind of develop all of the metabolic syndrome expressions.
Yeah, that was my case. I was getting fatter and fatter and fatter and fatter. And every time I go to the doctor, he'd say something like, well, everything's okay. Your blood pressure's is okay, you know, everything's all right. But he would say, you know, how long do you think that's going to last? I was like, I don't know. It's lasting good so far. And then one day my health fell off a cliff. My blood pressure got, you know, shot through the roof, and I had all of these other issues that were going on. And it was just, yeah, it was a dam broke. It was not a gradual slide into poor health. It was, you know, it was everything all at once. And it took some work to fix a lot of that. But yeah, so I can personally attest to that. So let's get into PCOS in particular. Can you describe what PCOS is, and you know, that process of getting it, and maybe some of the symptoms of it?
Absolutely. So PCOS is, well, first of all, it means polycystic ovary syndrome or polycystic ovarian syndrome, meaning many cysts on the ovaries. This is the name of the condition, although believe it or not, you can be diagnosed with PCOS even if you don't have the multiple cysts on the ovaries. Oh. And the reason being is right now, the diagnostic criteria. So in order for a woman to get diagnosed with PCOS, she has to have 2 out of these 3 things. So one is the irregular menstruation or ovulation that we talked about. So you can have either irregular periods, or you can have periods, as you said, but not have regular ovulation, meaning you don't ovulate every month. And this is like an important point, and I'm glad you brought it up right at the beginning. So this is one of the diagnostic criteria. The second diagnostic criteria is clinical expression of hyperandrogenism. This means expressing a high level of male hormones. It might not be high on labs. It's very hard to pinpoint normal and abnormal levels of androgens or male hormones in women on labs, but the expressions of it are very obvious, and we can talk a little bit about that. Symptoms such as severe acne, severe hirsutism, which is male pattern hair growth, and women know what I mean by this. It's very common. And male pattern baldness. Okay, so in women, it's again very obvious. So clinical expressions of high male hormones, very obvious. You can look at a woman and say, this lady likely has PCOS. Okay, it used to be known as diabetes of the bearded women, because
I thought that was interesting too. I'd never heard that term before.
They knew it was related to diabetes, or at least it seemed to show up together very often in older women, particularly. Okay, not menopausal women, but premenopausal women. And then the third diagnostic criteria is many or polycysts on the ovaries that show up on ultrasound. So these are the 3 diagnostic criteria. And right now, if you have 2 of them, you can get diagnosed with PCOS. PCOS is a syndrome, meaning it's on a spectrum. Not everybody has the same expressions. You can have some and not others. And you can be further up or further down on the spectrum. So further up on the spectrum, it's going to be a more severe condition. Further down, it might be more mild. So there's 4 phenotypes. Phenotype just means like categories or expressions of PCOS. I had the frank type, meaning the full-blown PCOS, even though I was thin. But when I was diagnosed, I had all 3 expressions, which is then classified as the frank type. Okay. So when I pressed my doctor for further and further, and when he actually went through everything, I had it all, including fatty liver, which is not a diagnostic criteria, and neither is obesity, but we know it occurs together. Okay? So that's what PCOS is. As I mentioned to you, Erin, a little earlier, it is the most common endocrine condition in women in their reproductive years, meaning between, your puberty until menopause. So the most common. So because it's so common, it should obviously be better known and better addressed. Okay.
Is there pain associated with it? Like I've heard some people, like some women, when it's that time of the month, they try to ovulate, they feel a pain in their side. Is that normal or what? Well,
many women with PCOS don't have a period for years.
Okay.
And that's the biggest problem. If you're a woman in your reproductive years and you don't have a period, this is a big problem. And unless we actually let women know this, because the pain would be there if you have, it's a different type of menstrual concern, okay? So it's a painful menstruation. And yes, that is very common in women with PCOS because they have a lot of inflammation. And maybe they have associated things like endometriosis. But if a woman doesn't have a period at all, which is not right, not normal,
Right.
not common, and not healthy, then she might not have any pain at all. But there are many other things. Women with PCOS, remember, and you know this, are insulin resistant, right?
Mhm.
They're hyperinsulinemic. They have higher levels of insulin. Because of this, they're going to have, as I said, they're going to have other associated concerns. And one of them might actually be very severe symptoms of PMS, premenstrual syndrome, because that week or two before your period, that PMS phase is actually a hyperinsulinemic phase, so
Okay.
meaning it produces a higher insulin resistance. And there's reproductive logic to this. If we were all very metabolically healthy, it would make sense that our insulin would rise post ovulation. But because most of us are metabolically unhealthy and already in a high insulin state, that premenstrual phase is very severe, very painful, very inflammatory, a lot of retention, a lot of irritability. If you're already in a high insulin state, during that phase of your cycle where your insulin is even higher, you can have it could be uh, extremely disturbing. And really, this is part of the things that I like to talk to women about, because these are the kind of things we want to resolve.
Okay. So this is the most, you said it's the most common thing that women of reproductive age are dealing with. You went through the three things that they can have. Are there other, I don't know how to ask this, but are there other things that
Associated
women need to
conditions.
be, say again?
Associated conditions.
Yeah. Are there other things that women need to look at and say, okay, I don't know if I'm missing a period, or because you can have menstruation without ovulation. That still kind of blows my mind. I don't know if I'm doing this, but I've got these other things. What are some of these other things that they can look at?
Well, we talked about obesity, right?
Right.
So if a woman has, for example, the male hormone expressions, right? Which, as I said, it's very obvious. We can hide it as best as we want. Women shave, women do all kinds of hair removal treatments. They use all kinds of creams and pills, and uh, they will do anything and everything to get rid of acne and hair growth, right? So they can mask that as best as they can, but they still know it's there.
Mm-hmm.
They may have a period, as you said, and it may be irregular. It may be regular, but they're not ovulating. And unless they're checking for ovulation, they wouldn't know. And the other criteria that we said, the polycystic, the polycystic ovaries on ultrasound, you wouldn't know unless you got an ultrasound, right? So you might only see the obvious acne and hair growth, and you may have never gotten diagnosed with PCOS, but you might have other associated conditions that may make you think that,
What about muscle growth? If you got
what about
high levels of testosterone in your blood, would that cause women to have, say, broad backs or
That's a
big
great question.
legs? Or
Actually, women don't necessarily have high levels of testosterone. I can
okay,
get a little bit into that with you if you like the science, Erin. What they have is freely available testosterone, because there's a hormone called sex hormone binding globulin that's produced in the liver. If insulin is high, the liver will produce less of this hormone. So then the testosterone that's naturally there, the normal level of testosterone, is not bound to this hormone. So it's free to act on the skin, on the hair, not necessarily on the muscle. So I don't think that women with PCOS, at least not significant, will build more muscle, or will be more aggressive, or will have
okay,
higher libido. Although in extreme cases, all of that would be possible. So if a woman really did have extreme high levels of testosterone, all of that would be possible. Except you can have PCOS by just having more bioavailable testosterone. It's not actually higher. It might
okay,
not be. There is a higher level of it, because again, insulin has a direct impact on the ovaries, on certain cells called the PECA cells, and the ovaries will produce more testosterone because of insulin. So again, it's always insulin. Insulin impacts the liver, insulin impacts the ovaries. Okay.
yeah. The description you went through in the book, which I thought was really interesting, was that it's this free testosterone that doesn't go to the right places. So
That's right.
if it goes to the head, you get male pattern baldness. If it goes to the chin, you get hair on your chin. If you get it on your face, it's acne or wherever. I mean, I thought that was interesting, and it's not something that I had ever really thought about. That it's this free testosterone that's causing all of these issues, as far as women having these more
Symptoms.
male issues. Yeah. Fascinating. So you've got PCOS. You've tuned into this podcast. You've got some of the symptoms. You've got PCOS. How do you fix it?
Well, simply enough, as Dr. Fung would say. So Dr. Jason Fung is obviously the co-author of the book. He's also a colleague of mine. I work with Dr. Fung and Megan Ramos at thefastingmethod.com, which is an online program for the intensive dietary management program. So Dr. Fung and I wrote this book together. And as he would say, he would simply put it, if the problem is insulin, and then the solution is to lower insulin. And how do we lower insulin? We lower insulin basically by doing two things. There's many other things you could do to help. You talked about one of them. So it's a major factor, not minor, stress, sleep and stress management, cortisol. That will have an impact on your insulin. But what are the two most important things that you have to do to address insulin? And this is the key factor of our book, because we want women to focus on what's actually going to help them. The problem with other literature on PCOS is that it talks a whole lot, but it doesn't focus on the root cause. A lot of the treatments recommended are symptomatic treatments, pills and this and that are actually not addressing insulin. The problem is insulin, and that's why we spend so much time talking about the things that you and I just talked about a little bit, more the science. You might not be so interested in that, and that's okay, as long as you understand that what's behind PCOS is higher levels of insulin. And the objective, the focus has to be lowering insulin. If women lose their focus into looking at the wrong places and dedicating too much time and effort into things that, yes, they're important, but they're not going to resolve the root cause of the problem. And I'm talking about things like supplements, exercise, and a whole bunch of other things. I'm not saying that certain supplements might not help symptomatically. I'm not saying that exercise isn't important, because we know it is. One, because it affects your mood, your muscle, body composition is important. You talked about cortisol. That's another great technique for helping with cortisol. But will exercise lower insulin? It will not. Okay. And the root cause of PCOS is hyperinsulinemia. So what are the two things that are going to help? Is addressing what you eat and how you eat. This is key, and women have to understand this, that this is what we need to focus on. This is what we need to put. You can do everything else if you're willing to and if you know what will help. But if you're not looking at these two factors, you're not going to have any significant impact on this condition.
Okay, so what do we eat? Exactly.
So looking at insulin, we know insulin is a natural hormone that our pancreas produces in response to eating, period. So we do produce insulin, but the problem is sometimes we produce too much insulin, and sometimes we produce too little. For example, children with type 1 diabetes, they have an autoimmune condition and they don't produce insulin. We don't want that. So we want to produce the right levels of insulin. But some people, like women with PCOS, produce too much insulin. So our objective is to try to reduce that insulin production by altering your eating, your diet, and how you eat. So what are the foods that produce the highest insulin response? Carbs. No, there's just no ands, ifs, or buts about this, okay? This is written in the book, but it's also written everywhere else. If you look into macronutrients, which means carbohydrates, protein, and fat, the macronutrient that's going to have the highest insulin production is carbs. Okay?
Right.
So this is the reason why lower carb diets and ketogenic diets get so much focus when we talk about PCOS, because these are the diets that are going to recommend a lower carbohydrate consumption. And I agree with that. All right. What's the problem with that for many women with PCOS? As soon as they hear this, they want to tune off because they're addicted to carbs, just like I was. They only want to eat carbs, so they want to find another solution. There is another solution, which is fasting. All right? But fasting does work better with a low carb diet. It's easier to fast if you eat less carbs, but it's a journey. Okay? So if you're going to eat less carbs, you're going to have appropriate levels of protein and higher levels of healthy fat. And right there, I've just described to you a ketogenic diet. All right?
Perfect.
We actually don't call it a keto diet in our book because we don't want people to we don't want them to lose focus and start looking at keto products.
Okay.
Sweeteners and ice creams, and because that's all.
SlimFast has a keto shake now. It just blows me away. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, because that's all going to raise your insulin. Remember that every time you eat, you raise insulin. So our objective here is to eat a real food diet that's going to have less of an insulin response, but it's also going to leave you free to have some gaps between meals when you're lowering insulin. That's called intermittent fasting or time restricted eating. So we're going to combine this real food, lower carb diet, ketogenic diet, if you want to call it that, with proper amounts of intermittent fasting. Okay. And I do a fertility sort of protocol with women or reproductive based on a woman's menstrual cycle. If they don't have a cycle, then we're trying to promote a cycle. And if they do have a cycle, we're sort of trying to follow the cycle to create a better eating pattern. Okay.
Well, okay. So let's go over fasting in general. Then I want to talk about how you're fine tuning it to a woman's cycle. But fasting in general, what are you recommending? 16/8 eating or 3-day fast, or what does that look like?
That's a great question. So fasting can mean a whole lot of things, right? Fasting for some means a 16/8, as you're calling it. I actually think that there's no one size fits all. So as a coach, I'll be totally honest with you. As a coach, I believe in individualized care. But what our book is trying to do is provide the best general recommendation for women, whether they're beginners, if they're just never heard of fasting, never heard of a ketogenic diet, we're walking them. First of all, we're trying to convince them why they should do this, and then holding their hand and walking them through these different levels. And we do talk about a 16/8 intermittent fasting, a 24-hour intermittent fasting, 36 hours. So we do go through the most commonly and we even talk about extended fasting, even though we don't have a protocol in the book, because that's it's a different level, and you should probably look for a bit further individualized care. Right. But it's a great book if you're just starting out and you know nothing about a low carb diet, nothing about intermittent fasting. Once we've convinced you that PCOS is an insulin resistant condition, this is how you do it. There is a practical guide in the book, and it can help you through it. If you're somebody who's much more advanced, and some women that buy our book know that PCOS is an insulin resistant condition. They know that the way to go is a ketogenic diet and intermittent fasting. Then our book might be good for these women because it will actually go through why PCOS is an insulin resistant condition, how insulin actually causes PCOS, and why this should be your primary focus, and not again, not that you wouldn't do other things that might be beneficial, but why you don't want to exclude this. You don't want to. I had a woman today, or last night actually, she said to me, well, your book just talks about keto and fasting. I wanted to read about other things because I don't want to do keto and fasting. My book and Dr. Fung's book is there to tell you that this is what you need to focus on. Okay? And make it work. Maybe a ketogenic diet is too strict for you. Then let's try to modify it. Maybe you need to fast a little bit longer, right? Etc. So my book. So when you say what do I recommend to people, it depends. It depends on where you're at. And when I work with women, I do follow their cycle.
Yeah. So let's talk about the cycle thing. So how are their nutritional needs or fasting protocol? How is that changing as you go through the different stages of the cycle?
Well, first of all, I would love to have the opportunity to work with women through different phases of their journey, okay? There's a preconception, and we talk about this a little bit in the book. There's a preconception journey, meaning before you get pregnant, you should get yourself into a healthier state. Why? Because of the associated conditions with PCOS. Right. Women with PCOS are not infertile. They can and do get pregnant. Unfortunately, they search for, not through their own fault, but the recommendation for PCOS women is to do fertility treatments. Right. And they will get pregnant. A whole lot of them will get pregnant. And so they get pregnant with a condition that hasn't been addressed. The concern here, and it's a big concern, and I was one of these women, is that your pregnancy complications or the risk of pregnancy complications is much, much higher. And these are serious complications, like preeclampsia, gestational diabetes, high pregnancy-related hypertension. And then there's postpartum concerns as well as neonatal concerns, meaning the baby is going to possibly have serious concerns because babies born to women with PCOS have a much higher risk of morbidity and mortality. Okay, so we need to know this and we need to put this out there, and that's what we've done in our book. Yes, if you're a PCOS woman and you go to a fertility clinic, 80% of the women there are going to have PCOS, and maybe half of them are going to be very successful. But do you want to get pregnant if you have PCOS? If you know all of this, no, then you don't. But in the preconception journey, it's probably 3 to 4 months.
Right.
If
Okay.
you could dedicate 3 to 4 months of your life to getting yourself into a better state, you're going to have a much better chance of getting pregnant, much higher chance, and a much better pregnancy outcome for you and your baby. So I would love to work with women during that phase, the preconception phase, and women that have read our book and do that themselves, I think. And then there's the trying to conceive sort of journey. Not that every woman with PCOS is trying to get pregnant. And our book is not only for women trying to get pregnant, because we talk about why you want to follow this protocol to prevent diabetes, obesity, hypertension, cancer, etc. So it's not all about pregnancy. It really isn't.
Right.
All right. So the cycle that I told you about, I don't know that you want to get into a ton of detail about that, but it just to keep it really simple. If we divide a woman's cycle in half, and day 1 is the day that they get their period, right?
Mm-hmm.
And day 14, if their cycle is really regular, and women their cycles do become regular very, very quickly once they follow a proper diet and intermittent fasting protocol. It's like a miracle thing, but it's not a miracle. It's physiological hormonal, right? We're physiological beings, and insulin is a very powerful reproductive hormone, which we didn't know, but now we know, okay?
Mm-hmm.
So if you have a regular cycle, a 28 day or up to 35 days, then day 1, your period starts, and your insulin production starts to decrease. It's a release sort of a state. And women know this. They lose a little bit of weight. They release, obviously, they have a menstrual cycle. There's other forms of release. They're less bloated, less retention, et cetera, et cetera. So this is the state that it's probably a lot easier to try some longer fasts if you're interested. You can prep for it.
Mm-hmm.
And then between day 1 and day 14 of your cycle is the time where you probably want to do some longer fasts if you're interested. And you can prep for this, and you can get coaching for this, and you can read up on this. This is the part of the cycle where it's safer to fast and it's easier to fast. It's physiological, and it's very interesting. Once you've ovulated, if you're trying to get pregnant, you probably don't want to fast, and it's not ethical for us to recommend fasting anyway, so we don't. But physiologically, it starts to get a lot harder, because this is where your insulin production starts to increase. So there's a lot of dietary strategies that women could do, and I do this protocol with women so that they can look at time-restricted eating, which means having full meals and no snacking, and also some dietary strategies. This is where probably having a more ketogenic diet and more fat fasting would probably help you. And fat fasting is just a dietary strategy that is used to deal with cravings, bloating, high insulin. It's a way to lower insulin through diet until you're back to day 1 of your cycle. So this cycle is very interesting to me, but it's not something we actually talk a lot about in our book. It's something that I talk about in my coaching more.
Okay, fascinating. Well, I mean, this has been. I think I've learned a lot about PCOS from the book and from this talk. I really appreciate you coming on and talking through this stuff with us. I hope that this book becomes a bestseller. I mean, I really do. I think there's a lot of women out there that are very confused about what PCOS is and how to fix it. And I love that this book exists. So I wish you and Dr. Fung and all them all the luck in the world to get this out and to get this into women's hands. Can you tell us a couple things? Where to find your book? Where to find you? Where they can find the fasting? Was it Fasting Method, Fasting Center, whatever it is? Where they can do all that?
So our program is called thefastingmethod.com. It's an online program, so that's why it's called thefastingmethod.com. It is an online membership program, so it's a community, which is probably one of the best things about our program. There's a large community of people doing fasting. There are a lot of resources, education, and support. So we have meetups, groups, kind of like classes and all that. We also have this coaching portion. So people like me, and there's other coaches that provide individualized one-on-one care. And this program was co-founded by Dr. Jason Fung, who's a Toronto nephrologist, and Megan Ramos, who's a clinician and researcher also in Ontario and Toronto. And they work together and have for the last, I think, 16, 17 years. And they created this program a few years ago, and I was lucky enough to join them in 2016. So that's where you can find me. I work exclusively for thefastingmethod.com.
Are you in Ontario, or are you still in Mozambique?
Neither. So
Neither.
I
Okay.
left Mozambique when I got pregnant with my second child, went back to Toronto. That's when I started working with Dr. Fung and Megan in Toronto, and I worked there
Toronto.
for a
Yeah.
few years. And now I'm in Europe. So
Oh,
I've
okay.
left. I've left. I live in Portugal, but I work for the online program. Myself and all the other coaches, we work for the online program to provide either the coaching or the membership community support. All right. Our book is called The PCOS Plan, Prevent and Reverse Polycystic Ovary Syndrome Through Diet and Fasting, and it's available on Amazon.
Okay.
So there's a paperback option, which you can already order. It's been available since April 14th. And there's a Kindle and Audible version, which is obviously for those that like quick gratification, you could get it right away and read it and absorb it right away.
Who recorded the Audible version?
Not me.
Not you.
You can hear a clip of it on Amazon. It's a great, actually they're huge. The clips are huge. Both the Kindle version, you can read the entire introduction and
Yeah.
part of chapter 1. The sample, right? And the Audible sample is also huge. It's a lovely voice, a lovely lady, but I don't know who it is.
Oh, okay. That's good. No, that's good. I wasn't aware there was an Audible version, so that's great.
There is, and there's a nice, if you go on Amazon, you can get a nice sample of the beginning of the book.
Perfect. Guys, we're going to have links to all of that in the show notes. You can find that at mysugarfreejourney.com/podcast. And Nadia, thank you so much for coming on the show. This is very, very informative.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me again.
All right, guys, hold on. We'll be right back with some more information.